This presentation looks at the connection between GDP and an idea called welfare. Welfare means standard of living or quality of life. In other words, how good our lives are in an economy. So let's look at whether GDP tells us what it tells us and what it doesn't tell us about welfare of people. Well, we've talked about welfare as referring to standard of living or quality of life. And these phrases, welfare, standard of living, quality of life, they are trying to convey the same idea. They're trying to express the same idea. How it feels to live, how good it feels, or how much we enjoy ourselves, or how much we suffer during our lives. Now, of course, when we talk about these things like welfare and standard of living, they do involve some degree of opinion. One person's idea of a good standard of living may be another person's idea of complete suffering. So it is subjective, it is normative, it does involve opinion. So we have to be very careful when talking about ideas like welfare and standard of living. However, we do try to answer the question, what makes for a good standard of living? Well, partly, I guess, it depends on how many goods we can consume. Consuming goods gives us pleasure, gives us utility, and therefore the amount of goods that we can consume surely has something to do with our standard of living. But clearly, in order to enjoy those goods, we have to have some time, and so therefore standard of living also has something to do with how long we live. And as well as consuming goods, there are other experiences that we can have in our lives, and standard of living surely must be about what we can experience during our lives. So if we take the amount of goods we can consume, how long we live, and what we can experience during our life, that pretty much constitutes what we mean by standard of living. And we can take this further. So basically we're saying that standard of living has something to do with the output of the economy because it relates to the goods that are available for consumption. But it also has something to do with our life expectancy, which is related to the healthcare which is available in the economy. It's related to what we can experience, and part of experience is learning. So it has something to do with education that's available. And of course, we must include, although it's difficult to define, the quality of our relationships with other people during our lives. So all of this is connected to this idea of standard of living. So where does GDP fit into all of this? Well, we know that GDP is really a measure of output. So that's really what GDP is telling us about. It's telling us how much we produce in the economy in 1 year. So does that really tell us about standard of living? Well, the answer is yes and no. We've already said that the goods that we can consume do contribute to our standard of living, and goods mean output. So there is at least one way in which GDP is connected to standard of living. But it is actually connected in more ways than that, because as the output of the economy increases, that means we're earning more income, and because output and income are really the same thing. So an increase in output means an increase in income, but that also means an increase in the tax revenue that is flowing to governments. So rising GDP also implies rising tax revenue to the government. And with that increased tax revenue, the government is able to supply a greater level and amount of healthcare and a greater amount and level of education. So these are two more connections, or another connection, between GDP and standard of living, because rising GDP or rising income does allow governments, through increased tax revenue, to pay for and provide at least two of the things that increase our standard of living. So as well as being connected with output and goods, GDP is also connected with health, and it is connected with education. And so therefore, we can say that GDP has a lot of connection with standard of living. And we shouldn't ignore it as a measure of standard of living. It's quite an important measure of standard of living. But there are, of course, there is another way in which it is connected as well, in the sense that if we earn more income, if our GDP goes up, then we have more opportunities, including the opportunity to travel, which widens our experience and increases our standard of living. So therefore, it is really true that GDP has a big connection with standard of living. And that's a good starting point for our discussion, because GDP, although it is connected with standard of living, is not a perfect measure of standard of living. It has several problems. And we can identify 4 major drawbacks between trying to make a connection between output or income and standard of living. So let's look at each of these problems in turn. First of all, GDP includes economic bads, what we call economic bads. So when we produce things like guns in our economy or things like cigarettes, the value of the guns or cigarettes produced is included in the GDP figure. So a rising GDP may indicate a greater production of these economic bads, such as guns and cigarettes, which clearly do not add to the quality of our lives, but take away from the quality of our lives, and yet they are included in GDP. And this is one of the first problems of using GDP as a measure of the standard of living or quality of life. But there are also many other things that GDP leaves out, which do increase the standard of living or quality of life, such as all non-marketed work. GDP only includes things that are produced and sold in a market. So when parents look after children, they are clearly increasing the welfare or quality of life of their children. But because they're not charging their children any money for this service, this is completely overlooked in the GDP number. So GDP does not include any non-marketed work, and even though most of this work does increase the welfare or quality of life of people in the economy, and that's a severe problem with GDP as well. The third problem with GDP is that when we look at GDP, we look at total GDP. That's the total output produced in an economy in 1 year, and this tells us absolutely nothing about how that output or income is actually distributed among people. So total GDP tells us nothing about national income distribution, and therefore it's quite possible to have a situation in which the GDP of a country is increasing, but where most of the income is earned by a minority of the population, in other words, very unequally distributed. So this would mean that the majority of the population are still suffering a very low standard of living, even though the GDP is increasing. So there is another way in which GDP may not be connected with standard of living. So we can see that GDP has many, many problems. And when we're trying to connect it with welfare or standard of living, it's very difficult sometimes to make that connection. But we did mention that there were 4 drawbacks of GDP as a connection with standard of living, and so far we've only mentioned 3. And the 4th one is that increasing GDP, also means changing our lifestyle. So the lifestyle of people in countries which have a high GDP can involve a lot more stress in terms of the hours that they work, and therefore these lifestyle factors may take away from our standard of living, our quality of life. And this, again, is overlooked by the GDP number. So we have seen that due to the fact that it includes economic bads, that it doesn't include non-marketed work, that it doesn't tell us anything about income distribution, and that it may imply that we are living a very stressful life, GDP may be a really incomplete measure of standard of living or quality of life, although there are connections between GDP and standard of living, as we have seen in the first part of the presentation. So we have to ask ourselves, can we really connect GDP with this idea of standard of living? Is it a good measure of standard of living? And as we have seen in this presentation, the answer is yes and no. Although there are some connections, some important connections, there are also some drawbacks with relying on GDP as our measure of standard of living. And as we will see in a later presentation, this has led economists and people in general to come up with alternative ways of measuring how the standard of living of an economy is developing over time.